Professional Development webinar series. In today's webinar, Reverend Robert R. Cannon will present a brief explanation of the theology of marriage, the role of the marriage tribunal, and how ministers can be a source of hope and healing for those seeking an annulment. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. I would like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel that you see here on my screen, and I'll read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you via email tomorrow. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Reverend Robert R. Cannon is a priest of the Diocese of Venice, Florida. Currently, he serves as the Chancellor for the Archdiocese for the Military Services in Washington, D.C. Father Bob has advanced degrees in theology, counseling, anthropology, and canon law, with a specialization in jurisprudence from the Gregorian University in Rome. He is a doctoral candidate in canon law at the Catholic University of America. He brings a wide range of knowledge and experience to share with you as a parish priest, marriage counselor, working with various marriage care programs, tribunal judge, and judicial vicar. Father Bob, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be with you. Will you be loading the slide deck for everybody to?
Yes,
okay.
Here we go. I just moved over to your PowerPoint, and I'll go ahead and close out my webcam, and you can take it from here.
All right, and if you would just move the slides as I,
Yep. Yeah, just say next slide. Yep. Wonderful.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining this. When Erin contacted me about offering a webinar on some of the issues that she mentioned, tribunal work, dealing with divorced, separated, married, and everything, it's always a challenge in just a very few minutes to come up with something that would be helpful to you. Again, we got a wide audience, so I hope there's going to be something in this webinar that will be meaningful to you, enrich your life maybe a little bit, help you in your ministry, and learn something you didn't know before. So I'm going to be moving through my slides fairly quickly, but if there's anything that sticks out that you are most interested in, I'd be more than happy to comment afterward in the question and answer session. But with all things, we should begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And this particular prayer comes from the Liturgy of the Hours, and it talks about the unity of love, and it's such a beautiful prayer. God, our Father, source of unity and love, make your faithful people one in heart and mind, that your church may live in harmony, be steadfast in its profession of faith, and secure in unity. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, if you look at the slide, what I'd like to do first of all is do a short review of the deep and rich theology of marriage from a Christian anthropological perspective. Most people never really have a deep appreciation for the richness of our theology of marriage, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that. The second point is looking at some of the cultural challenges to marriage and even marrying in some countries. It's not all the same around the world. Again, we're a universal church, but I'll focus especially on the United States and what we're trying to do. And then the church's response to the plague of divorce, as the Second Vatican Council said that it was, just becoming so rampant in the world, and this was like in mid-1960s. And then looking for some avenues of pastoral and canonical care of marriage from beginning to end. And again, looking for hope-filled approach to dealing with realities that I'll share with you. And then after that, we'll have a question and answer. So I'm going to be rolling through these things. Hopefully, again, there'll be sound bites and other kinds of things that will perk your interest. Aaron, if you just go to the next slide. Our theology of marriage is truly a beautiful vision of how couples should live together. And we see marriage as a sacred and divine gift. It's just not just a social relationship or cultural kind of relationship, but much more deep and profound than that. Going back to the story of Adam and Eve, one of the things that we believe is that with the fall, marriage was harmed, but it was not denied. It was not lost as a gift. And one of the beautiful things about Jesus is that he raised marriage to its primordial, form and holiness and goodness just by his presence. And even speaking again in the Gospel of Matthew, where he says that divorce really should never happen, that it's a man-made creation, that a woman and a man joined in marriage should live together until they die. It's also something that is more than simply a functional kind of relationship, but it's meant to be a partnership of the whole of life. You hear of this totius vitae consortium. It's meant to be a sharing, a self-giving of all that a person is to another. And so in that partnership, then they form this communion of life, this oneness of flesh. Again, it's such a beautiful teaching. And the other is that their conjugal relations end up being their body prayer, where they do become one. It's just not having sex, but rather much more than that, so that their gestures become healing and the deepest expression of communication between a man and a woman in marriage. Again, just very, very beautiful. St. John Paul II did a wonderful teaching on the theology of the body and pulling out the implications of moving from original innocence to original sin, and then the restoration of marriage and what marriage should be in this giving of total self to another person before Almighty God and making it truly holy. So John Paul II, if you've not read anything on the theology of the body, you should really read some of his talks that he gave over a couple of years at his Wednesday audiences in Rome. They really amplified, if you will, our understanding of marriage. The purpose of marriage, and many people don't really understand what marriage is. They just think, well, it's a legal way to have sex without feeling guilty, without feeling like you're committing sin, but they really don't have a real purpose. They don't understand the meaning of marriage from the sense of purpose. So in the early church, the wedding ceremony itself and the relationship of marriage was always seen as sacred and holy. The rite itself changed, but one of the things that people don't understand is that at the time, Roman law really was very, very influential, and the Romans had a beautiful way of presenting marriage not only as a relationship, but as something that belonged to the whole society as a whole. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why the Romans were so concerned about people marrying is they wanted the Romans and the Roman families to have children. And so the church adopted some of the Roman law approach to marriage. And one of the things that the Romans came up with is that there had to be some physical expression of consent where both parties, man and woman, agreed to give themselves to each other in a unique way. And it's that uniqueness then that the church captured, and the way the Romans described it as in the form of a contract. I'll do this if you do this, and we agree upon that. So that contractual notion of marriage is one of the terms that really dominated the church's thinking, is that when people give consent, and that's what forms marriage, they enter in this contract, and it cannot be broken, because it's of divine origin, especially between Christians, where it is a sacrament. So, and that's the one point I want to make very, very clearly. Not everyone who marries another person necessarily enters into a sacrament. They enter into maybe a natural relationship if both are not Christian. Sometimes people don't understand that if a Presbyterian marries a Baptist and they're both baptized, well, that's a sacramental marriage, even though they may not see marriage as a sacrament. And so when people come seeking relief from the church, sometimes people say, well, you married a Methodist and you weren't well, that person was married previously. Well, those marriages don't count because it wasn't a Catholic marriage. Or it just all sorts of very incorrect ways of addressing different types of canonical issues. So what the church did, and this is really beautiful, Second Vatican Council, it went from emphasizing the contractual obligations of both parties to an understanding of the spiritual nature of marriage, which is really a covenant. And it's that biblical language that is so beautiful, that when a man and woman exchange consent, they form this covenant, this deep spiritual reality. It's more than just a license from the county to get married, and it is this thing that comes into being, into existence, when they actually exchange consent. One of the things that people also don't understand, that there are some things that happen when that exchange is given, is that there's an expectation that from one party to the other, that the essence of marriage is one, it's indissoluble, and it's permanent. So it has a couple of properties, the permanency and the oneness that happens with that consent. And also there are what were traditionally known as three goods of marriage: children, permanency, fidelity, that it's in this exchange of consent, in this covenant that is created, that the couples themselves are sustained in life with each other in this community of love. They benefit from that consent with the goods that are exchanged, which is, again, permanency, fidelity, and children. And as you well know, that these goods are being challenged left and right as far as permanency and children, fidelity. The culture today is completely opposite in many ways to the teaching of the church. And it's not that the church is wrong regarding marriage, it's that the culture has changed radically. And most beautifully, and this is what all of the, if you read the Second Vatican Council Gaudium et Spes, the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, where they point out very specifically that this thing called marriage is so beautiful and so wonderful, as a gift from God, a divine gift to humanity, that it needs to be protected, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be fostered. And the goodness of the family then that is created builds the rest of society, and often we'll use in the church, the domestic church, where children have an opportunity to be evangelized and loved and understand the loving God that we're created with their parents. And so for many, many years, the church has always been very, very protective of marriage, actually from the very beginning, ensuring that marriage was kept safe from harm. Next slide, please. Now, there's some incredible cultural upheavals going on that is affecting marriage in many countries. And again, it's important to keep in mind that what happens in our country or in Europe isn't necessarily true in other countries where marriage is a very stable reality. Some of the things that are going on, and I just kind of pointed some of those out, is that we actually have a deluge, a plague of divorce in the wealthier nations in our own country. COVID-19 is nothing in comparison to the harm that is being done to people because of divorce. Just in our own particular country, for instance, the divorce rate in the turn of into the 20th century, like in the 1890s, just for a moment, what do you think the divorce rate was at that time? I mean, if you think about a country, a little over 100 years ago, what do you think the divorce rate was? Well, the answer is roughly 95 to 97% of all marriages basically ended by natural death. That means that only a handful of people actually got divorced. Then when you kind of fast forward it to about the middle of the last century, what we started seeing is a real creep in the rate of divorce, to the point that and it's held fairly steady, that the divorce rate for most first-time marriages is around between 45 to 47%, 1 out of 2. A little less for people that are Catholic or Orthodox Jewish and some other faith groups, but basically it's 1 out of every 2. And you have to ask yourself, what the heck happened? And what I found even more tragic is that when people eventually decide to divorce, or they have to divorce for different kind of circumstances and such, if they enter into a second marriage, guess what the divorce rate is? It's even higher. It's up in the 70 percentile, 72, 74%, depending upon what decade you're looking at. And the reason for it is that when someone who has entered into a marriage and they really want their marriage to last and be beautiful and all the dreams that they have to come true, even if they married with doubts, if they eventually get to the situation where divorce happens to them, or they have to divorce from someone, they're less willing to hang in there the second time around if they start noticing any kind of issues in their second relationship. And one of the other things that is happening is that we're not only getting married, people that are married once or twice, but we're getting people that are married 5 and 6 and 7 times in a lifetime, just in and out every 3 or 4 years. So this whole notion of divorce isn't only dealing with a person who separated and remarried. In the tribunal, we're dealing sometimes with people, multiple marriages, one after the other. I remember one time where I called a person up that had been married like 5 times. And I said, before I approve you getting married to your spouse, I just want to let you know that I'm really concerned whether you even believe in permanency. Well, the person started laughing and I went, oh gosh, this person probably, got a mental issue. And then they explained their life story of how they were in situations where they had to marry a drug addict, there's a drug addict, an alcoholic, and just out of survival. But the person actually was a very, very wonderful person. But so the divorce rate is not just for first-time marriage, it's second, third, and fourth and fifth marriages. I even pulled up to it was a nutrition store, and right next to it was a lawyer's office, and this car pulls up. On the back, this guy had 5 divorces on his license plate. I couldn't believe it. So what's happening in society is a real decomposition, I guess, of the understanding of marriage and family life itself. When I took a course in sociology of the family, University of Miami, for the entire course, we could not come up with one definition of family. And this was years ago. We're getting situations, if you just look at the slide there, hodgepodge of family structures. We went from the extended family to nuclear family to the diminished family. We've got LAT basically is living apart together, where people marry civilly, and yet they keep their own apartments because they don't like the way one person has their house decorated or whatever. People are postponing or not even getting married at all. I've seen situations where people have gotten an annulment and they'll get remarried, and then something happens and they divorce again, and then they just start living with people. They just don't even bother anymore. So we're seeing the effects of birth control, people not wanting to have children, double income, no kids is one expression. The myth of cohabitation, that's a huge one. Sociologists have looked at what they call cohort failure, and they look for reasons. And believe it or not, one of the reasons for people divorcing is if they live together prior to. You just say, well, why is that? If people live together and they're having sex and they know each other and this and that, well, it's kind of unconscious, but cohabitation is like a trial marriage. You try it, and if everything's going good, okay, then you'll stay in it. But if it doesn't, then you jump ship, and you're free to do that. Well, it sets people up for a divorce mentality, and they don't even know it. So one study that I looked at, there was like 500 couples, and they studied them prior to their marriages, those who cohabitated and those that did not. Then they went back 5 years later to see how many couples were still together, both those that had lived together and those that did not. What they found is that all of those that had lived together had divorced. It's quite incredible. And the sociologists that were studying this cohort failure couldn't figure out why, what was the reason. And the only thing they could say, and it was at the very end of the article that I read, is that values that sustain a marriage need to be lived prior to a marriage. That if you're going to be chaste in marriage, it has to be beforehand. Because if you're not chaste, then it's going to come back and dovetail. Pornography has been a horrible thing that has affected marriages prior to a couple getting married and afterward. When we talk about, addiction to pornography or online relationships and stuff where someone doesn't feel they're getting emotional support from their spouse, they contact somebody else, they have this online relationship, and then situations where they leave their spouse. What are polyamorous attitudes where people think, well, free love. I mean, free love was not invented just in the last 100 years. It's become more prevalent where people think that just having sex with someone, it's not a big deal if everybody's in agreement. It used to be a whole thing of reserving conjugal relations for marriage. Then it was, kind of make love, and now it's just having sex, like it's sport. And people don't understand the emotional investment harm that does. But yet, our young people and older people are being confused and seduced, and I'd call it a seduction of these lies regarding human sexuality. So the church's teaching on marriage and human sexuality is very profound, very deep, and very, very beautiful that many of our people do not even know. No fault divorce is a huge one that impacted marriages, where the lawyers thought and the legislators thought that if you made divorce easier, you'd have so many situations where people didn't have to weather through all sorts of legal stuff just to separate and divorce. What they found is that by having no fault divorce, you ended up encouraging people to divorce rather than working through their issues. And some state legislatures actually have tried to make divorce a little less easier and encouraging people to go for counseling and such. So all of those different things that I mentioned to you are all impacting our culture, even the very definition of what marriage is, same-sex unions and such. So it's not unusual for people to be confused. A lot of the social supports that marriage used to have in society have just basically washed away. Theologically, different faith groups have watered down their teaching on marriage, and they basically baptize the culture. In essence, that's what they've done. What I find, though, is ignorance of church teaching on marriage and human sexuality is a huge issue. It's a huge issue. Most Catholics don't. All they know is you got to be married to have sex, or you don't do this or this outside of marriage, and so they kind of have some primitive understandings. But the vision of human sexuality and marriage the church has to offer, they barely even get an understanding of that. Like one of the fun questions that I would do preparing a couple for marriage is I would simply say, okay, tell me what makes marriage holy? And they would just stare at me like, what makes marriage? Well, marriage, because it's a marriage in church. No, because God blesses you. Yeah, so why does God bless you? Why do we say it's a holy bond? What is it unique that we believe as Christians and as Catholics about marriage that is just so unique and different than the understanding of love in the world? And I just get these like deer in headlight stares, and I'll say to them, when you love each other and you forget about yourself because you love her more than yourself, or she loves you more than loves you more than herself, and vice versa, and you have this crucible of one loving the other, I said that's sacrificial love. And it's the same kind of love that Christ did. He sacrificed himself out of love for us and our salvation. So when you're on that altar and you say, I do, or I promise, um, you were saying to your fiance, who's now going to be your husband or your wife, that I love you more than myself. I love you more than myself. And God has to bless that. And so we believe it is a sacrament. We believe that God uniquely comes to dwell in that relationship of marriage with two Christians that creates something beautiful for the world. As a matter of fact, it's one of the things that the Second Vatican Council mentioned in Gaudium et Spes. You should read it if you haven't. It's just loaded with all sorts of beautiful, beautiful teaching. They basically said that a couple that truly love each other as Christian spouses and as parents shine. They shine forth in the world. Their vocation illuminates the world. And I can tell you as a priest, I love to be invited to people's homes where I can feel the love. I'm serious. Where I can come there and it's just like, yes, this is the way it's supposed to be. And I'm not talking about Pollyannish kind of you know, families. I mean, they're just regular families, but they truly love each other. So as far as the church's pastoral response to this plague of divorce, Aaron, if you just switch the slide there. Their church has always had, and this may seem kind of strange when I say this, a tough love approach. When they expected people, when they exchange consent to be faithful to each other, and the conditions for them to separate, and there are conditions, or to have to do a legal divorce had to be truly substantial. And our bishops of the United States are so concerned, and you may have never heard of the Councils of Baltimore, but that's where we got the Baltimore Catechism from and the initiative to have a Catholic school system. They basically had a particular law for the United States that was approved by the Vatican, that anybody that divorced and remarried as a Catholic were automatically excommunicated. So that is still out there in the world, that people think that they're excommunicated if they're again divorced and remarried. And sometimes people that are just simply divorced think that they're excommunicated. Like I'll give you a simple example, and this just made my heart ache. One of the bishops that I work with sent me this letter from a woman, and this is what she said, right on the same topic. I'm a divorced woman. When I divorced, I was told not to attend church because the church doesn't recognize a divorced person who has gotten married. So I respect that. The law is the law, and I will obey it. Just think of the hurt of that person. But then she added a second paragraph, and this is one of the reasons why I'm talking to you today. Recently, I had a conversation with Mrs. call her Smith. She's divorced and married Mr. Jones, who is an usher at St. such and such a church. They both are members of the church. Well, obviously they're also going to communion. So my question, has a church rescinded that rule? Can I go to my church or not? Or does Mr. and Mrs. Jones have a special privilege? So for years, people have suffered with misinformation about what the church's teaching is regarding divorce and separated, whether you go to receive the Eucharist or not, and the whole annulment process and all those different types of things. So what the church has done, and very beautifully, and the United States was actually at the forefront of looking at the process of annulments, for instance, and to see what could be done. The first was the fact that Pope Paul VI, he lifted that automatic excommunication for Catholics in the United States. It was a very, very beautiful thing, actually. It was seen as being no longer needed. The other thing that the church has tried to do to help, stop this plague of divorce is not only working on the healing at, if something's gone wrong, but the very beginning. And we still have to do even better efforts than we're doing right now. So for instance, intentional premarital efforts of all kinds, catechesis in our schools and our catechetics, and we've extended the time of engagement for couples. Those are just some of the things that the church has done. We can improve those more and more and more and more. I can tell you that when I'm talking with someone who has experienced a divorce, and we send them out this kind of questionnaire, it's got all sorts of questions about their family background, their spouse's family background, how long do they, just the story of their marriage, basically. More than once, a person who is petitioning for annulment will look at me and just say, why was I asked all these questions before I got married? I'm not saying the church is supposed to be asking those questions, but the person said, if I would have been asked these questions, or if he would have thought of the questions, they probably wouldn't have married the person that they had married. So the church is trying to do intentional premarital efforts, and it's very hard as a priest to get people to really appreciate the importance, because typically what happens when people approach the church to get married, they've already decided they're ready to marry. And that's probably the biggest obstacle in trying to offset people's eagerness in the sense so that they don't overlook issues. And one of the biggest ones, going back to cohabitation, is that often a young couple will think that because they have a good sex life that everything else is fine. And when they haven't worked on their friendship first and foremost to really build out the relationship, looking forward to the culmination of that relationship being in their conjugal love life, if there's nothing in the foundation, then there's nothing to really crescendo to as far as enjoying the conjugal love life that they look forward to. People turn to their sexual relationship more and more and more, and it just can't be sustained. So we're trying to do the best we can. For marriages, after couples of marriage, we've got marriage encounter, retrovi for those who are in troubled marriages, different types of support groups for couples, family programs and things in parishes. Those are all some of the ways in which the church is trying to stem the tide as best we can. So all of our programs have to be the best that they can be. When a couple that is planning on marriage comes to the church, they need to be welcomed lovingly, inspired to follow church teaching. Ideally, there may be a mentoring couple or another couple that will work with them to help them along, because we don't have the extended families that we used to have that can kind of just, again, mentor them, answer questions and different types of things. So the parish really is taking on much more of the responsibility for a lot of the premarital stuff that used to happen in culture, and the church is the last bastion, if you will, of traditional teaching regarding the gift of marriage. But the beauty of all of this, though, is there are so many wonderful couples that will come forward and just say, Father, we want to live what the church is asking us and what God is asking us in our marriage, and please help us. I tell you, when I run across a couple like that are so fired up to embrace each other in the love of God, with the love of God, and to really be a holy couple in marriage. I can deal with all the others that just want to go through motions and do the checklist. So the United States has again been at the forefront of a lot of things. So for instance, streamlining the formal elements of the annulment process. Most people don't know this, but the United States and our canonists developed what were called American procedural norms that shortened the time in how formal annulment cases were handled. And that streamlining process has continued in church law. So you look for things that can save time, that can be eliminated, that are just more formal kinds of things, and that's been a progressive type of thing for the last few decades. When you look at the expansion of tribunal staffs, that's another thing that the bishops did in the United States. They sent people away for school. They got computer systems. They really established large staffs to deal with this huge tsunami of annulments, to be able to help people understand whether they were bound to that consent that they originally gave. Grounds were expanded. And the other thing that's really important is that church teaching also again evolved to explain marriage as a covenant of life and love. And if you look, the church's teaching becoming much more what is called personalistic. We're emphasizing not just the contractual functional things of having children and education, those are all absolutely essential, but how marriage and marital love can heal and embolden, lift up, strengthen the spouses themselves in community of love. It's very, 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 very beautiful. So when you look at ecclesial teaching, Casti Connubii, Gaudium et Spes, Humanae Vitae, Familiaris Consortio, the revision of the Code of Canon Law and how it processes cases, the Holy Father writing on Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. I mean, imagine the joy of love, Amoris Laetitia, joy and hope, the dignity of marriage, and Metus Judex, again, simplifying formal annulment cases. So all of that, when you think of it, put it all together as a response to the plague of divorce, the tsunami of people entering the marriage and divorcing has been a great pastoral effort of the church. Next slide, please, Aaron. So a couple of things that I would like to point out to you is that every person's marriage is unique. Never treat a person who comes in who has gotten divorced, who has an irregular marriage situation, with the same kind of litmus test. They're all different. There are so many angles to look at to try to assist the person. So if you do not know that the answer is, simply say, I don't know, but redirect the person to someone who should know. Invariably, people will call the parish and they'll get an answer from someone that is absolutely off the wall. The person should never have given the direction, just said, oh, you don't have an annulment case. Well, they've never met with the person, they've never talked to the person, they don't know the background. They may not even need an annulment case. That's one of the reasons why, the validation of civil unions. Many, many Catholics don't know that they have to get married before a priest. Canonical form, married before duly authorized priest and deacon in front of two witnesses. And if they're free to enter into marriage, they can if there's no impediments at all. Well, that's the traditional form of marriage. But if they get married before a Baptist minister without dispensation, for instance, they think, well, I've left the Catholic Church. No. Years later, they'll say, well, my husband and I didn't get married in the Catholic Church. Well, do you still love him enough to get married really in the Catholic Church? Oh, yeah. Well, let's do it. Okay. And then, they celebrate their 25th anniversary, and the wife who was Catholic or the husband was Catholic just said, I never thought she'd do this or he would do this. And it's a great celebration of their faith life, and often one of the spouses themselves will become Catholic. So anybody that calls you on the phone, anybody that shows up at the office door, always don't presume that you know the answer, but know where to get them the answer. So one of the things too is the sacrament of reconciliation. Sometimes people just, for some reason, they think the church doesn't love them, doesn't care about them, and just say, well, there's no obstacle. Your former husband died. You're not married now, or you did marry and divorce, but you just need to go to confession. One of my most joyful stories actually was we would have outreach days in my diocese, and we go to deanery and deanery, and this old woman gets out of her car with the help of her niece, I presume, and she's all kind of shaking and everything else in her 80s. And I was walking outside before presentations began, and I said to her, "Can I help you?" And she says, "You're not going to yell at me." I went, "Why would I yell at you?" She says, "Well, the last priest I spoke to yelled at me." So she was a young mother with like 3 or 4 kids with an abusive husband back in the 40s, I guess, 50s. And she went to confession. And again, at that time, people that, divorced and remarried were excommunicated. The priest yelled her to confessional, true story. And she never went back, even though she sent her kids to religious education and everything else for the sacraments, but she herself felt that she couldn't walk through the doors. So here she is in her 80s now. Talk about the sadness of this poor woman. And I go up to her and I said, "I'm not going to yell at you." And we talked and everything else. She was able to receive reconciliation, and I introduced her to her pastor and the bishop. And I saw her sitting at the table and her hands were shaking, with a cup of coffee. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she says, "I'm just so happy. I'm so happy. I'm just so happy." I said, "Yeah, yeah. You met your pastor, your bishop, and everything, good things squared away just in one day." Anyway, I could go on and on with those kinds of stories. So one of the things about how we handle irregular marriages is that there's different types of situations. Not everything is a formal annulment case. You can have people that um, didn't get married in the church and divorced, who are Catholic, maybe a lack of form. It could be a defective form where they didn't exchange their consent. They did some kind of new age wedding in a Catholic church, what I believe around happens. And they read letters from marriage or their was it, um, yeah, their encounter weekend, premarital encounter weekend, whatever it was. And, but it wasn't married. I mean, I was a witness to that. It was unbelievable. Um, There's Pauline Petrine, and then there's formal cases. So I would breeze through those things because they're more technical, and for most people, you don't need to know a lot of detail of that. Other than, again, not every person's situation is going to be the same. Most people's situations are unique. The formal annulment case, um, again, what the church has done, uh, we've eliminated a lot of the cost, the time. Um, it's so important to recognize the fact that we always treat both parties the same. Um, Marriage does have the support of law, which means that if a person is petitioning for an annulment, I mean, if that is what the particular situation is, marriage has the support of law, which says that most people marry validly. It's not the exceptional person that marries validly. And so the person has to have evidence or grounds to be able to actually challenge that marriage. Um, so it's the importance of marital history. That's very, very important and critical. Family life of both people, their dating history, what happened right before the marriage, what happened right after the marriage, and what happened a few years later in the marriage. And what most people don't understand is that, yes, you can challenge a marriage that has existed for years, 25, 30 years, if at the time of the marriage, which is the consent, when they gave their consent and formed that covenant, that was the time that we really focus in on. Could they really do that? Was there any obstacle to keep that that covenant from forming, from that consent from being valid? So it is a microscope in a way, trying to discover something with using external evidence to prove something that is ultimately spiritual. An annulment is not about saying the marriage didn't exist. What we're saying is that the covenant of marriage did not form because there was something in the consent, either intentionally or unintentionally, that kept that marriage from truly being a marriage as we understand it. And so when there's a challenge to the validity of the marriage, ultimately what happens is the judge has to arrive at a conclusion, either in favor of the marriage or not. And that's decided on the truth that is presented. So it's very important when you have someone who wishes to petition for formal annulment, that before they send anything in, a good write-up on their marital history and all those questions that I mentioned is really important, because what a lot of people think will cause the nullity of a marriage, it doesn't have any real canonical value. I mean, because he always wore, just trying to think of golf shirt and Dockers pants and some type of shoe every time he went out is not necessarily going to mean that the marriage is invalid. So it has to be a substantial reason, and then the judge has to decide with moral certitude the best that the judge can understand about the situation. So it's not perfect, but I would say that if there were substantial reasons why the marriage ran into serious trouble, there are grounds that need to be looked at. Well, what's also important is never assure somebody that there's going to be a particular answer to their petition. That's a big mistake, because until everything is in, until that judge makes that judgment moral certitude, you just don't know. Sometimes people give them false hopes. One of the myths in our society is that the whole notion of it's called a divorce mentality, but people just say, oh, get a divorce and just get an annulment. Bad. It doesn't work like that. But that's in our culture now, that, well, just go ahead and get an annulment. No, it doesn't, it's not true. The biggest thing is when there are no grounds, how to be merciful, how to be kind. And I would state this principle, and the Holy Father mentioned this in challenging judges, that you have to look at the evidence that is before you. And even though Pope Francis talks about mercy, mercy has to be rooted in the truth. If it's not rooted in the truth, then it's a lie, and it cannot be good. Mother Teresa, I love one of the lines she says, truth is rooted in love. And so if we're really loving people, we're going to be truthful with them, and then let them wrestle with that. And sometimes that's the case. But ideally, we do everything that we can to let them know that they're loved and cared for, even though everything that they want to be fixed can't quite be fixed like they would hope. Finally, one of the things that Pope John Paul II did at the very end of the code, which was of canon law, which is very beautiful, he puts in this little line, salus animarum, that that the salvation of souls must always be the supreme law of the Church, to be kept before one's eyes. It's the very last line in the Code of Canon Law. It's the most quoted one. And so as a canonist, anything that I do, and as a pastor, as a priest, how do I love on these people so that I can bring them to Jesus? I mean, that's the real thing. I mean, that's the real purpose of ministry. How do I bring them closer to Jesus, then before God, and then be filled with the Holy Spirit? And if each of us does that in just a little bit, in helping people that are carrying heavy burdens in this crazy society in which we live in, culture and mixed messages, we'll be doing them a great favor to be Christ for them, giving them the truth of the gospel, giving the truth of church teaching. So that's a rapid little discourse for you. Happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Father. And I definitely invite anyone to send in a question for Father. Here we go. So I've already have a couple questions here, so I'll just dive into them.
Dive in. Let's go. Let's go
yes,
for the gusto.
Yes.
All right, I'm ready.
Daniel says, I'm a volunteer with the youth ministry at our parish, specifically the teenage youth group. I have a student whose parents recently divorced, and I'm unsure how to address it. Should I wait for him to bring it up? Should I offer my support and wait for him to contact me? Can you provide advice on how I should support him through this situation?
First of all, it's really important that you care, and it's that caring that will win the day. So not to play counselor or this or that, but just asking a young person, how are they doing? You might broach the subject if it's a public kind of situation about the divorce. How you doing? You know, with the divorce, your parents, can I help you in any way? I wouldn't go any further than that. That's about as far as I would go. What most young people need is just they need people that can be around them just to support them, whether they say anything or not. Being loved when their crucible love and their family is just kind of broken apart and hearts being torn. Having a safe place to go where they're loved that's a great medicine, healing balm for them.
Hmm. And could open the door for more, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
So, how would you respond to somebody who is a divorced Catholic who feels alienated in their church, in their parish?
It depends upon the reason for the alienation. For instance, I mentioned the woman that was yelled at, you know, when she was just a young mother, and she had substantial reasons why she had to get away from an abusive husband who was an alcoholic right in the line. Um, so you need to kind of ferret out what is it that's causing her to be feeling alienated. It may have been something that somebody said to her. It may be even more important, just inviting her to go to church with you, just butting up with the person so they're not going there by themselves. Like sometimes people think that, you know, if they do something wrong, that everyone knows and everybody's looking at them. They may not, it may be just the person themselves. So getting them involved in a simple ministry of greeting or working in RE, there's a variety of ways in which a person then can build up relationships in the parish and families. So that make it one-on-one TLC.
Hmm. Once again, going back to forming those personal relationships with people, so
Mhm.
important. Let's see, I got another question here. Tiffany says, I'm director of faith formation at my small church, and I'm presently going through a divorce. I would like to start a program to either help couples getting married or those experiencing divorce or annulment. Any advice, opinion on what to focus on first?
Is that a trick question? No, it's all important. Uh, it's so important for our couples that are preparing for marriage to have a great experience of marriage preparation. Often they don't. I'm just being honest with you. There are a variety of reasons for that. Sometimes the couples have everything else lined up and they don't have any time to really take advantage of what's being offered. So getting them early, especially with youth groups, high school, if you have any kind of college students there where you can, again, build relationships with them. Um, those who are divorcing, who are divorced, have a lot of heartache that is painful and wrenching very often. And the thing is that in our society, most family members, if a family member is getting divorced, they don't want to ask anything about it. And so they're walking around basically having to bear everything in their own heart. Family members don't want to touch because they don't want to, intrude and things like that. So having a group that does more than simply sit around and talk about divorce, but has some other kind of focus would be very, 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 very useful time, useful loving, rather than just pouring over the heartache, and let that be again part of the healing balm. But people do need to share and be able to talk about and laugh over silly things, and um, in many instances, especially in abusive situations, they need to have professional counseling. So they're not just trying to figure it all out themselves. One of the benefits actually of the annulment process, when there's a formal annulment process, we get the marital histories, like I described and you'll see tear stains just on the paper where people were crying as they were writing things out. So the annulment process can be cathartic, even though it's not designed to be that. And ideally, tribunals will be caring and loving and steer people to groups that are in the diocese that can be of help to those who are burdened and suffering.
Can you share, or do you know of any resources for support groups in parishes for those dealing with divorce?
There's there's so many that I wouldn't have a particular one to choose from. To be honest with you, uh,
Mhm.
Retrivai has always been is for those couples that are going through serious issues. But for those who are divorced, most dioceses have at least a coordinator for divorced and separated. You may want to look there in your diocese first. I basically
Okay.
had almost a direct line with the one priest that ran that and that particular support group.
Okay. So go to your diocese first and see what's
Right, and check
available
with the
there.
right, family life office. Yeah,
Mhm. Okay. So going back to the teen question that I asked, one of the first ones I asked, a woman asks here, um, how can we teach the church's stance on love and marriage, but keeping their hurt in mind at the same time? So kids, right, of divorced parents.
the hardest thing for young people, even adults, is they just don't know why. They don't know why mom and dad got divorced, and that's probably the biggest emotional hurdle, unless there were some dramatic kinds of things that the kids saw. Um, Again, if the divorce rate is as high as I described to you currently, if not higher, um, the kids are already wrestling with what is marriage all about, and offer them hope for their marriages in the future, depending upon what the age group is, by teaching the truth about our vision of human sexuality, and then in marriage, very, very positive things. Um, and the good thing about young people is they want the truth. They just want the truth, and then they'll deal with it, but do it, provide them the truth in a way that is at their level, you know. But
Mhm.
there's no easy answer to any of this because it's so disruptive, and that's the reason why the scourge of divorce it does harm young people. And there's that myth in our cultures that, oh no, they'd be fine. No, they're going to have to. There's a lot of healing that's going to have to go on.
Mhm.
So again, having groups that they can participate in and buddy up with, that's very, very important.
Great. Um, John asks, when a married person wishes to join RCIA, and this person had a previous marriage, when is the best time to talk about the sacrament of marriage and the annulment process?
Immediately. It's so important to look at that marriage situation before one starts the RCIA process, and you get that resolved so that you can enjoy the process without having this other thing there. That's to have that resolved.
Okay, immediately. Yep.
Yes, before enrolling RCIA, because what happens is that there's no timeline for how long an annulment may take. It's not like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. So it's important not to be under the pressure to hope that you're going to have a positive outcome, an affirmative
Mm.
decision, and you're getting up to um, going to the cathedral and being
Right.
and signing your name on the book, and then you get up to Holy Week, and then you can't be received into the church because the situation, it's just really bad.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Father Bob, thank you so much for your time. For all of this is very helpful. And we know that there are many people out there doing great things in the church, right, regarding marriage
Oh,
and
absolutely.
yes, and helping those through divorce and annulment. But certainly, I'm sure there is room for improvement and ways that we can do it better too. So thank you for sharing all of this with us. And for everybody who's been on with us today and submitted questions, thank you too. We are offering you 25% off any order of books at Ave Maria Press using code webinar 0525, and that will expire on the 4th of June. And this is the last webinar of our spring series. We will be back in September, so I certainly hope that you join us then. This has been a great series. I hope you all have enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you for supporting our series as you all do every week. Thank you all. Father Bob, again, thanks so much. It's been great meeting
Blessing
you
everyone.
and spending time with you. Take care, everybody.
Okay.
All
God
right.
bless.
Bye-bye.